On a wind-cut March morning in 1984, with frost still hard in the gravel outside Hastings in Adams County, 19-year-old Cole Lawson rolled a rust-flecked 1968 Chevrolet C10 into Halverson Ag Equipment and parked between two polished diesel pickups that cost more than his family had kept in checking during the previous 5 years. The Chevrolet door sagged when he opened it. The tailgate chain was wired with baling twine. The odometer had already crossed 241,300 miles, and the vinyl bench seat was split wide enough that yellow foam showed through his work coat. Cole stepped out in patched brown overalls, a faded thermal shirt, and boots that had been resoled twice. He carried one manila envelope in his left hand. Sales manager Brent Halverson saw him from the parts counter and smiled the way people do when they are already writing someone off. Brent wore a pressed blue shirt with the dealership logo, a clean white cap, and square-toed boots that had never sunk into spring mud. His belt buckle was polished. His truck out front still had dealer plates on it. Cole asked for salvage bearings and gasket sets for a seized 1953 Farmall Super M. Brent asked what serial range. Cole gave it. Brent nodded, then asked whether he was planning to finance a replacement tractor anyway, because old steel like that usually meant a larger problem underneath. Cole slid the envelope open and laid out the facts with almost no extra words. Title to the Farmall, one death certificate copy, and $200 in cash, folded in 20s and 10s. Brent laughed, not loudly enough to draw the whole room, but loudly enough for the men on stools by the coffee urn to hear it and turn. The laugh had confidence in it. It carried the prevailing consensus in rural finance at the time. If you did not borrow, you did not grow. If you did not grow, you disappeared. Cole did not argue. He asked what he could buy for exactly $187.43 and still leave enough for diesel to get home. For Cole, that moment started at a parts counter had been set in motion several years earlier at his own kitchen table, under a buzzing light fixture, with one dead bulb and a table edge worn pale by decades of elbows. His father, Dean Lawson, had farmed with practical skill and the same caution his own father had practiced until 2 back-to-back weather years pushed him toward what seemed like normal operating leverage. In 1979, Dean borrowed for fertilizer at 14.2% annual interest and for diesel on a separate revolving note at 16.8%. In 1980, he refinanced short-term carryover into longer notes because grain prices dipped below projection and one hailstorm erased yield on 31 rented acres. On paper, each decision was reasonable in isolation. In aggregate, the structure became brittle. By harvest of 1981, Dean's notes totaled $38,640 principal across 3 instruments, with blended annual interest expense above $5,400 before any principal reduction. Auction checks came in and left almost immediately. One grain settlement for $12,380 never touched household reserves. It went straight to accrued interest, then late charges, then fuel suppliers who had shortened payment terms. Cole was 15 and old enough to recognize a pattern, even if he did not yet have language, for debt service coverage ratios. He could see his mother writing grocery totals twice. He could see his father sleeping less and adding numbers after midnight on the back of seed invoices. Dean suffered a stroke on a February evening and died 3 days later. No dramatic final speech. No hidden account discovered in a drawer. There was one machinery line item with negative equity. One inherited Farmall Super M that had seized after sitting through one wet season, and the remaining $38,640 obligation that consumed nearly every saleable asset over the next months. The livestock trailer went first, then the newer hay rake, then 72 acres of rented ground were surrendered when inputs could not be prepaid. Cole watched the local auctioneer read serial numbers while neighbors stood in respectful silence because they were good people, and they knew this could happen to any of them. What stayed with him was not anger. It was arithmetic. Interest had taken the first cut from every check and had demanded that cut regardless of weather, market, or health. At the kitchen table in March 1981, with his mother asleep in the next room and a feed sack spread open so he could write on clean canvas, Cole put down one sentence in black marker: "Never sign interest again, not even once." The sentence was misspelled the first time. He crossed out one letter and rewrote it, then folded that feed sack square and kept it in the same envelope where he later carried his $200. There was no dramatic rescue and no fast rebound. The practical sequence was harder and less visible. He worked days for neighboring operators at $5.25 an hour during planting and $6.10 during harvest, took payment in cash when offered, and accepted partial in-kind compensation when cash was tight. He repaired fence for feed credit. He hauled bales for diesel. By late 1983, he had accumulated $3,940 in cash reserves while paying household utilities, property tax arrears, and basic maintenance on buildings that were one windstorm away from major failure. He tracked every number in school notebooks because he could not afford mistakes and because memory is generous while ledgers are not. In 1984, he rented 40 acres of dryland corn at $52 per acre, total rent $2,080, paid in 2 installments without borrowing. Input costs were trimmed to the bone: seed $1,140, fertilizer $1,260 using lower application rates matched to soil test reality, herbicide $388, diesel $614, repairs $239 before the Farmall rebuild, crop insurance limited coverage $310. Total direct cost came to $6,031. The field yielded 92 bushels per acre. At $2.74 per bushel across 3,680 bushels, gross revenue was $10,083.20. After rent and direct costs, margin before household draw was $4,052.20. Thin, but real. More important, no lender had claim priority over his crop check. The Farmall restoration was the first visible expression of the rule on the feed sack. Cole spent exactly $187.43 at Brent's parts counter that March morning. Crank bearings, $63.20. Full gasket set, $41.85. Used manifold from salvage inventory, $29. Carburetor kit, $18.50. Oil filter and fluids, $21.68. Miscellaneous fasteners and solvent, $13.20. He did all labor himself except one valve seat cut performed by an older machinist in town who charged $20 cash and a side of beef trim. Total outlay, including that machinist, $207.43. Comparable financed replacement power at the dealership would have started near $18,000 used or above $30,000 new, with annual payment structures that could have exceeded his entire net farm income in low-yield years. His living costs were similarly unsentimental. In 1985, his full personal expense ledger showed $6,842 for the year. Groceries and pantry staples, $1,920, after butchering his own beef and canning garden produce. Utilities, $1,146. fuel and truck maintenance $1,088, clothing and boot repair $214, property tax and insurance share $1,372, medical and dental $502, church and local obligations $180, miscellaneous $420. He mended coats rather than replace them. He cut and stacked his own wood to hold propane use down in winter. He kept driving the same Chevrolet C10 even as the speedometer cable began jumping above 50 miles per hour. By the end of 1986, the truck had crossed 247,000 miles. The driver's side fender had rusted through in 2 spots, and the engine still started because he changed oil on schedule and fixed small failures before they became expensive ones. People noticed the appearance and assumed the balance sheet matched it. That was the familiar social shortcut, and in rural counties it carries real consequences because reputation affects lease opportunities, supplier terms, and who gets invited into informal partnerships. Coffee shop talk framed Cole as stubborn, maybe proud, definitely too small time to matter. Brent Halverson reinforced the same view every few months with polished urgency about modern financing packages. He was not cruel. He believed what most of the industry believed. Scale required leverage. Leverage required confidence. Confidence looked like signed papers. Narrator insert. The exact moment Brent called a bank to verify a cashier check he thought could not exist came later, and that call became one of the clearest arithmetic reversals Adams County ever witnessed. By the spring of 1987, Cole's notebooks were about to collide with the formal banking world, and the county was about to test whether patience could survive a culture built on borrowed speed. Cole drove to Hastings State Agricultural Bank on the second Tuesday of April 1987 because the loan officer had called twice and said the meeting could not wait until after planning. The same rust-flecked 1968 Chevrolet C10 rattled into the lot at 8:12 in the morning, exhaust ticking in the cold, one headlight trim ring held on by a mismatched screw. He stepped out in the same patched overalls Brent had laughed at 3 years earlier, now patched again at the knee with darker canvas. Inside, the waiting area smelled like new carpet and coffee. Brent Halverson was already there with a leather folder, a glossy equipment brochure spread open to a row crop tractor priced at $74,900 and the look of a man attending a routine closing. Loan officer Marlene Pike did not mock Cole. She did what bankers are trained to do in an expansion cycle. She pointed to commodity forecasts, scale efficiencies, and dealer incentives, then slid a printed term sheet across the desk. Operating line: $180,000, variable rate 11.9%, annual renewal contingent on machinery modernization and minimum acreage targets. Required equipment package through Halverson. Ag: 1 used high horsepower tractor, 1 planter, 1 grain cart, 1 tillage pass update. Total annual machinery payments, $31,284, not including fuel, repairs, insurance, and labor. Estimated gross margin improvement, according to the projection, would close the gap if corn held above $2.55 and yields stayed near trend. The projection looked clean because clean assumptions always do. Cole read every line and asked for the stress case. Marlene provided 1 sheet. At $2.20 corn and a 10% yield drop, debt service ratio fell below covenant by harvest. At $1.95 corn and 15% yield loss, carryover note required. Brent leaned back and said most operators rolled notes for a year or two and came out stronger when markets corrected. He said it in the confident tone of prevailing consensus, the same tone that had shaped the county for a decade. Cole folded the stress sheet once, then again. He asked one question. What is total interest year one if rates rise 2 points? Marlene ran the numbers on a desktop calculator and gave him the figure. $25,002 before principal reduction under that scenario, with additional fee exposure on renewal. Brent answered before she could continue. That is the cost of getting real scale. Cole thanked both of them, picked up his cap, and left without signing. Before we go any further, if you want to know exactly how that unsigned page turned into one of the largest cashier checks Adams County had seen, subscribe and stay through the auction call that silenced the whole crowd. Outside the bank, his truck door stuck halfway because the hinge pin had worn oval. He pulled it shut with both hands, sat still for a full minute, and opened the envelope he still carried from the parts counter years. The folded feed sack was inside, edges soft from handling. Never sign interest again, not even once. The line had started as grief arithmetic. By 1987, it had become a framework, and frameworks matter when pressure arrives dressed like opportunity. 3 days later, he made the decision that looked small to everyone else and structural to him. He sold 30 bred heifers for $18,900 at a local livestock sale, taking a lower immediate herd trajectory to build liquidity before planting. Then he walked a neglected 80-acre parcel south of inland owned by widower Glenn Bartell, whose perimeter fence had fallen in 3 long sections and whose north waterway needed hand clearing. Glenn asked cash rent. Cole offered sweat equity instead. Full fence rebuild with posts, wire, and labor, plus waterway grading and rock pickup in exchange for 2 years at reduced rent. First year $0 cash. Second year $35 per acre. Glenn studied him, then agreed on a legal handwritten lease witnessed at the county office. That one agreement did 3 things at once. It preserved cash. It added ground without interest. It converted labor into control of productive acres, which is the oldest wealth engine in agriculture and the least discussed in sales rooms. By late May 1987, his season stack looked like this. Original 40 acres at $52 rent, plus 80 acres on sweat equity terms. Total planted corn acreage 120 dryland acres. Seed cost $3,480, fertilizer $3,610 with conservative rates, herbicide $1,142, diesel and lubricants $1,406, twine and incidentals $214, repairs $628, crop insurance $700 to $40, total direct outlay in cash $11,220, because rent on the added ground had been paid with work, not checks. Yield averaged 98 bushels per acre despite uneven rain. Total production 11,760 bushels. Average sale price after basis and timing $2.58. Gross revenue $30,340.80. After direct costs, taxes, and household draw, year-end cash reserve closed at $9,440. The first line in a ledger sequence he guarded like a title deed. By the second week of January 1988, he had copied the prior year onto clean pages and started again. He added 28 cow-calf pairs through disciplined, incremental purchases funded from reserve rather than borrowed notes, spending $11,760 total across 3 sale dates. Calf sales and cull timing produced gross livestock income of $24,410 that year. Corn acres held steady at 120, with a yield at 104 bushels, an average realized price $2.41 producing $30,076.80 in grain revenue. Total farm gross crossed $54,000. Total expenses, including repairs and household needs, held under $42,200. Year-end reserve, $21,305. Zero interest paid. In that same period, Brent visited twice, once in June and once after harvest, both times in a clean dealership pickup with promotional financing sheets. He stood by the Farmall Super M and said Cole was burning future money by refusing newer iron. Cole listened, wiped grease from his hands, and answered with 6 words. Future money is money I keep. The Farmall itself had become a discipline instrument. He did not romanticize old machinery. He budgeted it. In 1988, he set aside $62 per month, cash envelope method, for anticipated failures on the Super M and attached implements. Actual annual repairs came to $511.37. Ignition components, 1 used rear tire tube, hydraulic hose replacements, and 1 machine shop bill for a pulley groove rebuild. Comparable financed replacement would have required annual payment, far above $10,000. The difference did not disappear. It accumulated as optionality. The county did not read optionality that way. Appearance still carried the louder signal. At the co-op scale, men with newer tractors and leveraged expansion plans looked successful because they had the symbols lenders recognized. Cole looked like a holdout from an earlier era, faded coat, old truck, narrow acreage, yet his notebooks were building a different reality under the surface. In 1989, weather turned friendlier and prices improved slightly. Cole pushed planted acres to 160 by adding a 40-acre share arrangement on marginal ground where he paid the owner with 1/3 crop split and complete fieldwork labor. Corn averaged 101 bushels on owned and rented acres, total bushels 16,160, average sale $2.63, grain revenue $42,500.80. Livestock revenue reached $27,980 after a strong calf run. Total operating and living expenses came in at $52,014. Year-end reserve, $38,772. Again, zero interest paid. The county kept rewarding the appearance of growth, even when the arithmetic punished debt exposure, and the choice between speed and control was already setting up the next cycle on both sides of that divide. The early 1990s opened with exactly the kind of mixed signals that ruin one-dimensional strategies. Input suppliers extended terms aggressively. Equipment reps pushed upgrade now before rates move. Cash rents in some tracks rose faster than yield potential justified. Cole did not argue the culture. He kept decomposing every choice into fixed obligations versus reversible costs. Fixed obligations could drown a good operator in one bad year. Reversible costs could be trimmed, delayed, or substituted with labor. In 1990, he did not buy land, even though one parcel came up at $820 per acre, because his reserve target for durable purchase was a minimum of 60% cash cover plus 12 months operating cushion. He kept saving. In 1991, he passed again when rates and local bidding overheated the same quarter. By July of 1992, probate sale listings created an opening that matched his framework. 120 acres, mixed class soils, poor fencing, weak road approach, asking pressure from heirs who wanted fast settlement. Sale price cleared at $96,000. Cole paid cash with 2 cashier checks and kept $14,600 in reserve after closing costs and immediate repairs. That purchase marked the first time county records showed loss in the land increasing rather than shrinking since his father's death. It did not change his appearance. The Chevrolet crossed 260,000 miles and still looked one hard winter from retirement. His coat remained mended. His boots were patched at the welt. Brent still called him parts counter poor when talking to other customers. Yet one line in the ledger had shifted from survival to trajectory. Land without liens does not send invoices in dry years. It does not reset rates at renewal. It waits while markets recover. By harvest 1993, the framework was no longer a teenage vow. It was a functioning operating system, built in plain sight by a man most people thought had stayed small. By harvest 1993, he proved it again with numbers no one at the coffee counter ever asked to see. Corn averaged 109 bushels across his mix of owned and rented ground. Calves sold into a steadier fall market, and the year closed with $28,940 in liquid reserve after household draw, property taxes, and a full winter repair budget. He did not celebrate in public. He replaced 3 broken gateposts, serviced the Super M, and wrote the next year at the top of a clean notebook page. 1994. Leased 60 additional acres on a crop share split, paid no cash rent on that tract, gross farm income $96,380, total expenses including living $79,110, reserve $46,210. 1995, hail on the western parcel cut yield by 14%. Livestock carried margin. Reserves still climbed to $52,884. 1996. Corn price strengthened. Calf weights improved. Reserve reached $79,480. 1997. Sold cull cows high. Bought feeder calves low. Net gain expanded. Reserve $116,903. This was the pattern that mattered. He was not maximizing one season. He was preserving control across many seasons. Consequently, when 1998 brought the 160-acre listing northwest of Hastings at $735 per acre, he did not need permission from a lender or a dealer floor plan. Purchase price was $117,600. Closing costs, survey updates, title work, and back taxes added $4,382. Total outlay came to $121,982, paid from savings and cattle profits accumulated over 11 disciplined years. He had entered the summer with $181,302 in combined reserve and marketable grain. He exited closing day with clear title and $59,320 still liquid. By late autumn of 1999, that remaining liquidity was rebuilt to $102,550 because no interest invoice arrived each month to skim first claim from every check. Brent Halverson continued to stop by with polished urgency and promotional sheets. One offer in 2000 carried a 7-year equipment package at 8.4%, with annual payments of $44,900. Brent framed it as efficiency. Cole ran the arithmetic on scrap paper in front of him. At that payment, one bad crop means rollover. He handed the paper back and returned to replacing a worn hydraulic coupler. His ledger moved faster through the early 2000s because his acreage base and market timing improved together. In 2000, gross farm revenue crossed $142,000 and reserve reached $148,770. In 2001, drought-stress trimmed bushels, but cattle and hedged grain sales kept reserve positive at $161,440. In 2002, he built 2 used grain bins, bought at auction for $19,300 total, and installed with local labor, creating storage flexibility that added an average 23 cents per bushel in captured basis and timing over the next 3 seasons. In 2003, reserve reached $236,910 after taxes. Then came the 2004 expansion, that county rumor later described as luck. It was not luck. It was sequence. A 240-acre tract hit market at $1,180 per acre because the estate wanted a clean close before winter. Purchase price was $283,200. Closing and legal costs added $9,860. Total, $293,060. Cole liquidated grain bin carry inventory, redeemed certificates accumulated in staggered maturities, and sold 44 head from his cattle line at favorable weights. He wrote 1 cashier check and 1 certified supplement, then still held an operating cushion above $40,000. The underlying tension in Adams County sharpened in those years. Many operators were choosing speed through leverage because commodity optimism and low initial rates made that path look rational. Cole chose slower accumulation because reversibility had more value to him than optics. The trade-off was social as much as financial. New equipment in a driveway communicates progress instantly. Paid-off land and low fixed obligations do not announce themselves. By the spring of 2006, his annual personal living ledger was still austere by county standards. Food, $4,980, utilities, $2,440, truck fuel and maintenance, $2,210, clothing and boots, $390, medical, $1,620, insurance and taxes on home. Place allocation, $4,860. Church and local obligations, $620. Miscellaneous, $1,740. Total personal draw, $18,860. His 1968 Chevrolet C10 crossed 287,000 miles that year, with rust opening along the rear wheel arch and a replacement seatbelt bolted through a reinforced plate. People saw the truck and thought scarcity. The balance sheet said something else. 3 winters later, the other side of the county's strategy appeared in full. Eli Kramer was a strong operator and a respected neighbor who expanded aggressively after 2005. He financed land and rolling equipment until total variable and short reset exposure reached $1,260,000. At first, rates near 4.9% looked manageable against projected yields. But resets came during weaker commodity pricing and higher input costs. His annual interest burden moved above $93,000, then above $110,000 when terms tightened. One poor harvest year forced asset sales. The year after that, the bank called additional collateral. Eli lost the farm his grandfather had assembled over 2 generations. The auction was orderly, the crowd quiet, and no one mocked him because every person there understood how thin margins had become under stacked obligations. Dawn and Pete Voss faced a different chain of pressure and the same destination. In 2008, they financed 2 tractors and a center pivot irrigation package on terms that looked workable at signing, with combined annual payments near $86,400 and input assumptions built on stable fertilizer pricing. 2 low-price seasons cut expected gross by more than $140,000 across that window. They restructured once, then again, paying fees each time, while principal barely moved. Foreclosure followed when their operating lender refused a third extension. They were good farmers. They were caught by timing and financing structure, not laziness. Ramon Ibarra signed a balloon note to add acreage and improve his line after several profitable years. The note required a large refinance event in year 5. When that date arrived, collateral values had softened and cash flow did not meet the new bank threshold. He could not roll it forward. He sold equipment under pressure, then surrendered core acres. Curtis Bell borrowed against land equity to bridge medical bills after his wife's treatment expenses exceeded insurance limits. He kept farming as long as he could, but debt service plus health costs hollowed his operating cash. Bankruptcy came in stages, then all at once. The prevailing consensus had told all four that debt was a tool. It was a tool. The non-trivial part was that tools behaved differently under stress than under brochure assumptions. Cole never used their losses as argument material. He brought hay to Eli one winter when trucking got tight. He hired Ramon for seasonal mechanical work because Ramon could diagnose older hydraulic systems faster than anyone in the township. He paid on time. In the first week of July 2012, the drought turned from worry into event. Heat held through pollination, subsoil moisture collapsed, and dryland fields across Adams County burned yield off by the day. Corn leaves rolled by mid-morning. Pastures browned early. Local talk shifted from expansion to survival in less than 3 weeks. Operators carrying heavy annual payments had no room to wait for weather that did not arrive. Cole's numbers were painful but survivable. His average corn yield dropped to 63 bushels per acre on affected parcels, yet crop insurance and prior year reserve let him cover operating costs without emergency credit. Because his land stack had no lender claims, no bank meeting could force liquidation of title to keep a line open. He cut discretionary spending, delayed non-essential upgrades, and sold grain in measured lots as basis improved. The year ended lean, not catastrophic. Many neighbors did not have that buffer. Eli Kramer's final restructuring attempt failed during that period. Rate adjustments and collateral calls landed within the same 12-month cycle. Dawn and Pete Voss watched payment schedules collide with drought-reduced revenue and lost their last negotiating leverage. Curtis Bell's medical obligations, already heavy, became unmanageable when crop margin disappeared. Ramon Ibarra exited remaining leased acres and took full-time mechanical work. None of them failed for lack of effort. They failed because fixed obligations do not bend when weather does. Let me stop here and ask you something. If you were choosing for your own family, would you take slower growth with fewer fixed payments, or faster growth that depends on stable prices and steady weather? Put your answer in the comments, then come back to the ledger because the next decade made this choice even sharper. When conditions normalized, Cole resumed his steady pattern with the same understated discipline. In 2013 and 2014, he prioritized soil amendments on owned ground, funded in cash, because higher fertility improved resilience more than additional iron in the shed. In 2015, he bought a used combine header package at an estate auction for $28,400 that would have cost over $74,000 through standard dealer channels. In 2016, he added small parcels and easement-adjusted strips, totaling 90 acres at blended cost below county average because he could close quickly without financing contingencies. By 2018, county records showed him controlling 1,820 acres between owned and stable long-term leases, with most core ground lien-free. Brent still read the visual signals and missed the structural ones. He saw patched cuffs, old truck paint, and a man who asked for parts first. He did not see reserve layers, bin strategy, or the optionality that comes from zero interest drag over 3 decades. In 2019, he tried one more modernization pitch with a package that assumed 7.1% financing and annual obligations that would have exceeded $120,000 before major repairs. Cole thanked him, declined, and bought used components elsewhere for a fraction. 10 years after the drought, another stress test arrived from a different direction. In 2022, input inflation hit hard and fast. Nitrogen that had run near $410 per ton moved to roughly $1,020. Phosphate and potash climbed in tandem. Fuel surged. Operating lines across the region repriced above 8%. And some borrowers with weaker collateral were quoted meaningfully higher after fees. The arithmetic turned brutal. Higher per-acre cost, higher financing cost, uncertain output pricing windows. Cole absorbed the shock because he had prepared for shocks as a category, not as a prediction. He prepaid portions of fertilizer when seasonal opportunities open, reduced exposure on marginal acres, and shifted timing on discretionary field passes. More important, no lender could raise his annual payment schedule because he did not have one. During forced sales that followed in late 2022 and early 2023, he bought durable used equipment at an average of 38 cents on the dollar. A planter listed near $94,000 equivalent for $35,700. A grain cart package valued around $52,000 for $19,600, and support implements in similar ratios. Cash preserved in quiet years became purchasing power in hard years. By March 2023, the same county that once treated him as small-time was watching his trailers leave auctions with paid receipts and no financing packets attached. Brent watched too, and for the first time he understood that Cole had moved beyond survival economics into strategic liquidity. He did not concede it publicly. He scheduled one final sales push anyway, convinced he could still convert a man he had underestimated since 1984. Brent chose a Thursday in late March of 2023 for that final push, timing it after morning feed and before Cole usually left for parts runs, and he came prepared like a man determined to correct an old misread. He parked the dealership pickup beside the weathered machine shed, stepped out with a new folder, and laid out a modernization package on Cole's hood as if it were a final exam. One late-model tractor, one precision planter retrofit, one combine upgrade path, blended financing at 9.3% with seasonal payment structuring, total annual obligation just under $128,000 before fuel and wear parts. Brent's tone stayed controlled, professional, almost patient, but the underlying message was unchanged from 1984. Real operations carried real debt. Cole scanned the pages, then turned them sideways and ran a thumb down the payment columns. He asked 2 questions about variable reset language and collateral cross-default terms. Brent answered both. Cole nodded once. No interest signatures. Still no. Brent looked across the yard at the same 1968 Chevrolet C10, now with 309,400 miles and primer patches over old rust, and he shook his head with a half-smile that carried equal parts frustration and certainty. You are still parts counter poor, Cole. You just got lucky longer than most. Cole folded the papers and handed them back without irritation. Luck does not balance ledgers. By the first week of April, he had moved from field planning to a different kind of review, one that happened at the same kitchen table where the feed sack rule had been written 4 decades earlier. He pulled 39 notebooks from a cabinet, lined them by year, and rebuilt his position with methodical precision. Titled acres, lease rights, grain and storage, cattle inventory, equipment at conservative resale values, cash equivalents, less tax liabilities, and near-term obligations. The number that settled at the bottom was $4,812,670 in net worth, with no operating debt and no machinery liens. Personal living expenses for the prior 12 months totaled $19,372, including utilities, food, medical, truck upkeep, taxes, insurance, and church giving. That was the pivot. Survival had stopped being the objective. Optionality was no longer enough by itself. The framework needed to outlive one operator. He wrote a new page, this time on legal pad instead of feed sack, and titled it Lawson Zero Interest Circle. Terms were simple and hard. Short-term notes for equipment or entry acreage at 0%. Documented repayment schedule. No balloon clauses. No compounding penalties. And one covenant each recipient had to sign in plain language. When you are stable, you fund one more farmer, not donate if convenient. Fund. The resulting tension was deliberate. It protected dignity through repayment while multiplying stability across families. If you are learning something from this, take a second to like and share it with someone who believes debt is the only way to farm at scale. Within 3 days, the first candidate was sitting at that same table. Maya Chen was 31, farming rented acres with strong records and weak collateral, exactly the profile conventional lenders priced harshly after 2022 repricing. She needed a reliable planter and tractor package to move from custom rate dependence into timing control. Total requirement was $140,000, itemized to the dollar. Used tractor, $86,500. Planter and metering rebuild, $39,200. Transport and setup, $5,300. Contingency reserve, $9,000. Cole offered a 5-year zero-interest note at $2,333.33 monthly equivalent with seasonal flexibility. Secured by equipment title only, no claim on her home, no cross-default hooks. Maya read the covenant twice. And when I finish, you do this for someone else. She signed. In early May, Ty and Nolan Reyes came in together, hats in hand, carrying records of custom harvest income and a rejected bank application that had quoted them 8.8% with a down payment requirement they could not meet. They had identified 180 acres contiguous to leased ground, listed at $2,420 per acre. But the seller needed a fast, clean close. Cole structured a $220,000 land option package through his own purchase and pass-through contract. He bought the tract in cash, then granted the brothers a 10-year option at fixed principal recovery and zero interest, with annual payments of $22,000 and a clause allowing accelerated payoff without fees. They would not own title on day one, but they would convert rent into ownership on defined terms instead of praying through resets. By mid-June, a third case brought old County Payne back to the table. Lena Ibarra, Ramon's daughter, asked to recover part of the ground her family had lost in the balloon note collapse. Market value in that corridor had risen near $3,400 per acre. Cole had acquired a 140-acre tract in the same block during a pressure sales cycle and offered her a staged path instead of a speech. First tranche, 75 acres at $1,950 per acre, total $146,250, zero interest carry over 8 years, annual payments $18,281.25. Remaining acres could be leased with purchase rights once the first tranche stayed current for 24 months. She cried once, quietly, then asked where to initial. 3 days passed before auction notices made all of those private agreements relevant to the whole county. A large Adams County estate listing set a November sale for 1,120 acres with mixed classes, strong water access, and high expected competition. Brent, now hearing bits of Cole's private lending through normal rural information channels, assumed the old pattern still held. He assumed Cole was stretching beyond his real capacity and would tap out in open bidding. On November 14th, 2023, under a gray sky and a crosswind that pushed dust against parked trucks, bidders packed the lot. Brent stood near the registration table in a pressed coat, speaking in low, confident bursts with 2 financed expansion groups and 1 outside investor rep. Cole arrived in the same 1968 Chevrolet. Paint dull, rear bumper slightly bent, boots dusted from morning chores. Several men glanced at him, then back to the larger bidders. Appearance still made first impressions. Bidding opened hard and moved in clean increments. At $2.4 million, 1 outside group dropped. At $2.9 million, a local partnership stalled. At $3.1 million, only Cole and 1 investor remained active. Brent, close enough for surrounding rows to hear, said what he had been rehearsing for months. "Cole, you should sit this one out. This level is not for salvage budgets." Cole did not answer him. He lifted his card again. Final hammer fell at $3,360,000. Silence lasted 2 full beats, the kind that lands only when a crowd realizes its working assumption has failed in public. Cole walked to the settlement table, removed an envelope from his coat, and placed a cashier check for $3,360,000 beside the contract packet. No financing addendum. No contingency language. Paid. Brent asked to inspect the check. The clerk handed it over. Brent stared at the issuing line, then requested verification. Voice steady, but tighter than before. With the clerk's permission, he called the issuing bank on speaker in front of the table, naming routing details and instrument number. The bank officer confirmed the check was valid, fully funded, and backed by available cash reserves beyond that amount. Brent thanked her, ended the call, and for once had nothing to sell into the moment. The defeat was complete because it was numerical, not theatrical. Arithmetic had spoken in his own arena. By the following Monday, Cole converted the headline purchase into structure. Of the 1,120 acres, he retained 480 as core operating ground and moved 640 into long-term lease-to-own frameworks tied to the Circle Covenant. Maya received 260 acres under a 12-year path with fixed per-acre conversion credits and no interest load. Added to her existing 60-acre lease block, she now controlled 320 acres with equipment that she owned on a zero-interest trajectory. Ty and Nolan received 240 acres under their option ladder, allowing rotational flexibility while they advanced payments on the 180-acre title track. Lena took the 140-acre block tied to her staged repurchase terms, with the first 75 acres priced at $1,950 and recorded purchase rights on the balance once performance triggers were met. Those moves were not charity in disguise. They were disciplined capital allocation designed to replace fragile debt stacks with survivable payment geometry. Monthly obligations were clear. No variable rate traps. No balloon cliffs. No compounding fees for weather they could not control. The deeper examination mattered because without it, the story could be mistaken for a single dramatic check. It was not one check. It was 40 years of differential drag. Had Cole taken the 1987 package and followed the prevailing 7-year upgrade cycle Brent promoted, his modeled path looked like this under conservative assumptions. 1987 operating line, $180,000 at 11.9%, variable, average annual interest first cycle, approximately $21,420, 7-year interest, and fees about $149,800. 1994 reset and expansion package. Principal exposure rising to $265,000 at blended 8.7%. Cycle interest and fees near $96,300. 2001 machinery and operating expansion. Effective exposure $410,000 at 7.9%. Cycle drag about $131,200. 2008 replacement cycle and carryover pressure $560,000 at 6.8% with 2 stressed seasons. Interest and restructuring costs near $238,700. 2015 precision retrofit cycle $690,000 at 5.9%. Cycle interest and fees around $171,900. Add operating carry spikes in drought and inflation years, plus renewal charges and total paid interest and financing friction from 1987 through 2023 exceeds $2,143,000. Cole's actual path recorded different totals. Repair-heavy years, used auction equipment, targeted cash purchases, and deferred upgrades produced cumulative machinery and major repair outlays of roughly $612,400 over the same period. Difference preserved for land control and liquidity, about $1,530,600. That preserved capital, recycled through timing and no lien collateral strength, enabled the 1992, 1998, 2004, and 2023 land moves without lender control rights. This dynamic is the core thesis in numbers. Debt did not merely cost interest. It would have consumed strategic freedom. Recipient arithmetic reinforced the multiplier design. Maya's $140,000 note replaces lender terms that would have charged roughly $37,000 to $49,000 in interest across 5 years, depending on resets. Ty and Nolan's $220,000 track avoids about $86,000 in projected interest under standard regional terms and converts lease leakage into title progression. Lena's 75-acre tranche at $1,950 instead of market $3,400 represents immediate entry savings of $108,750 before financing effects, and the zero interest carry preserves her working capital for seed, fertility, and repairs rather than lender spread. Across the first 3 circle contracts alone, avoided interest and entry cost relief exceeded $300,000 on day structure, not counting downstream compounding. By December 2023, Eli Kramer had accepted Cole's offer to manage grain logistics on salary with health insurance, steady work replacing the volatility that had broken his operation. Dawn and Pete Voss entered fixed rent rebuilding terms on 120 acres with no surprise escalators. Curtis Bell stayed current on a modest home loan while driving cooperative trucks. Ramon Ibarra, still one of the best mechanics in the county on older hydraulic systems, handled paid maintenance for circle recipients and had Sunday dinners with Lena again. The crowd at the November auction remembered the speakerphone call. Cole remembered the feed sack. The county records remembered the checks, and the circle, quietly, had begun to turn. The first payment into the circle arrived on January 3rd, 2024, when Maya Chen drove to Cole's kitchen with a cashier stub, a paper ledger, and mud still frozen on her boots. She paid $2,333.33 on schedule, then an extra $400 principal because her fall basis sale had cleared stronger than expected. Cole wrote the receipt by hand, logged the overpayment to principal, and handed her a copy without ceremony. That was the design. Dignity through structure, not favors. By planting season of 2024, Maya's 320-acre operation had shifted from fragile to stable in ways that showed up in plain arithmetic. On her prior custom hire arrangement, delayed field windows had cost her an estimated 11 to 14 bushels per acre on late-planted tracks in wet springs. With owned timing control on the zero-interest equipment note, her weighted average yield improved 9.6 bushels per acre that year across corn acres. At $4.42 realized corn pricing after basis, that timing gain alone represented roughly $13,570 in added gross margin. She used part of it to prepay 2 Circle installments, reducing note life by 7 months. Ty and Nolan Reyes needed a different path because their risk was land access volatility more than machinery timing. They made their first $22,000 annual payment on the 180-acre option in November 2024, then added $6,000 from custom harvest income after a strong Milo contract season. Their 240-acre lease-to-own block under the November allocation gave them crop rotation room they had never had under year-to-year leases. By the end of 2025, they had paid $50,000 total principal on the option track, built a cash reserve of $74,300, and avoided the refinancing trap that had blocked them at the bank window. Lena Ibarra's trajectory carried the emotional weight of 2 generations. She paid her first annual $18,281.25 installment on the 75-acre tranche in full and on time, then kept current through the second year while leasing the balance under clearly written purchase rights. In the summer of 2025, she and Ramon rebuilt old terraces on that ground, with rented machinery and weekend labor. The work was slow, but it kept topsoil where it belonged. Her operating line needs stayed modest because zero interest on land carry preserved working capital for fertility and repairs. She was not reclaiming the past. She was building a different structure than the one that had broken her family. 3 days after Lena's second payment posted, Cole activated the covenant steps she had signed. He asked her to review one application from a younger operator and recommend terms she believed were strict enough to preserve repayment and fair enough to permit entry. She did it, line by line, because the circle was never meant to center one man forever. Eli Kramer's recovery was quieter and in some ways harder. Salary work in grain logistics lacked the visible status of running his own farm, but it gave him health insurance, predictable income, and distance from the renewal dread that had defined his final debt years. He earned $68,000 in 2024, $71,500 in 2025, and rebuilt retirement savings through automatic deductions he had never been able to sustain during leveraged expansion. On Saturdays in harvest season, he still walked fields with Cole and spotted storage bottlenecks before they became basis losses. Competence had never been his problem. Structure had. Dawn and Pete Voss stabilized under fixed rent on 120 acres, $168 per acre, with no surprise escalators for the initial 5-year term. That predictability let them plan inputs against known obligations instead of variable lender demands. In 2024, they posted a slim positive year. In 2025, they replaced a failing grain auger with a used unit purchased through Circle-side referral at 1/3 of dealer equivalent cost. They did not bounce back overnight. They rebuilt exactly the way most farms actually rebuild, one controlled season at a time. Curtis Bell kept driving cooperative trucks, paid his modest home loan current, and finally reduced revolving medical balances to zero by autumn 2025. Ramon Ibarra expanded from seasonal mechanic work into year-round service contracts on older hydraulic systems for 4 circle operators, billing $84,000 gross in 2025 with low overhead because he worked out of a refurbished bay on leased ground. He and Lena stayed reconciled, and Sunday dinners stayed on the calendar. By February 2026, the first full-circle ledger looked like a repeatable model rather than a one-off act of generosity. Principal deployed since launch. $1,840,000 across 11 family units through notes, options, and lease-to-own credits. Weighted default rate, 0. Delinquencies over 30 days, 1. Cured in 39 days after weather delay on custom work receipts. Interest charge, 0 by design. Covenant compliance, meaning each stabilized recipient funding or formally co-funding 1 additional operator. 8 complete, 3 in progress. The multiplier effect was no longer theoretical. It was recorded in county filings, payment books, and title transitions. In acreage terms, the cascade was larger than most people expected. Those 11 families collectively controlled or owned 3,460 acres by spring 2026 under lower fixed payment structures than conventional debt pathways would have imposed. At a blended local valuation of about $5,175 per acre across varied classes. That represented land value exposure near $17.9 million, linked to operators who otherwise would have entered later, smaller or not at all. The circle did not create all that value, but it changed who could hold it and how brittle their obligations were when stress arrived. Brent Halverson watched these changes from the side of an industry he had trusted for 3 decades. He did not disappear after the auction call. He kept working through 2024, sold what he could, and faced a customer base increasingly cautious about variable obligations after the inflation shock. For the first time in his career, younger operators came in asking for older, paid-off units and repair budgets instead of long payment ladders. Brent could have fought that shift and lost with it. Instead, he adjusted, gradually and without fanfare. By the second quarter of 2025, he had introduced a used equipment advisory track at Halverson Ag, including side-by-side sheets that compared 7-year finance totals against cash purchase and repair scenarios. The numbers often favored restraint, and he stopped pretending otherwise. At a county farm meeting that fall, he said one sentence that traveled fast because it sounded unlike him. Payment size is not the same as progress. He never delivered an apology speech to Cole. He did not need to. His pricing boards changed. His recommendations changed. And younger farmers noticed. Marlene Pike, the same loan officer who had shown Cole the 1987 stress sheet, retired in 2025 after revising lending standards in her final years toward lower leverage thresholds and stronger stress assumptions. She told colleagues that the most useful borrower she ever met was the one who asked for downside math first. Glenn Bartell passed away peacefully in late 2024 at 86. In his estate notes, he left a line for his grandchildren. Labor can be rent if both sides keep their word. Cole attended the service, sat in the back, and said little. Cole himself stayed exactly where people had always seen him and seldom understood him. At 58, he still drove the 1968 Chevrolet C10, now at 311,000 miles, with primer patches and a repaired door hinge that still needed a hard pull in cold weather. He still serviced the 1953 Farmall Super M with ritual precision each winter, changing fluids, checking tolerances, replacing small failures before they spread. He still wore faded work coats with mended cuffs. Appearance remained modest. The balance sheet remained formidable. County documentation in 2026 showed him holding 2,940 acres directly, with additional structured transfer rights moving through circle contracts, and total net asset value near $17.9 million, depending on seasonal grain inventory marks. No blanket lines sat on his title stack. No operating lender could accelerate his obligations. His personal draw stayed restrained, still under $20,000 in annual living costs most years, because consumption had never been his project. The feed sack survived in the kitchen drawer, folded along the same creases, ink faded but legible. Never sign interest again, not even once. It was not a universal rule for every farm in every context. It was his rule, born from one family's collapse and tested across 40 years of droughts, price swings, pressure cycles, and social judgment. Evidence in Adams County suggested the underlying principle had broad force. Fixed obligations that cannot bend in bad years are more dangerous than low status in good years. If you want more stories where arithmetic overturns assumptions, subscribe and stay with this channel. If you are in agriculture, comment with one specific number from your own operation you track to stay in control, whether that is interest per acre, machinery cost per hour, or reserve months on hand. Share this with the person who looks broke in an old truck but pays cash at the parts counter, because that person may be carrying the strongest balance sheet on your road. That evening, after checks were logged and notebooks stacked, Cole shut the kitchen drawer on the feed sack, walked to the shed, and set a clean pan under the Farmall before cracking the drain plug, oil running dark and steady into steel while wind moved across lean-free ground outside. He let the last stream fall, wiped the drain bolt threads with a clean rag, and tightened the plug on the Farmall with the same short pull he had used for years. When he stood, the shed light caught the side of the old envelope in his coat pocket, the one that had once carried $200 and a tractor title. By the third week of February 2027, that envelope carried three things instead: circle payment stubs, a folded copy of the original covenant, and one handwritten note from Maya that read, "Paid ahead, ready to fund the next one." That morning became a working session, not a ceremony. Maya arrived first in a dusted pickup with 2 binders and a check for the remaining balance on her machinery note. Final principal posted at $11,666.71 after her extra payments. Ty and Nolan came 10 minutes later with their annual $22,000 option payment, plus $9,400 additional principal from custom work. Lena brought her third annual land payment and a draft term sheet for an applicant she had vetted herself exactly as the covenant required. They spread papers across the same scarred kitchen table where Cole had once written his own rule on a feed sack. Eli sat at the end with a legal pad, now handling logistics and ledger reconciliation, with the precision of someone who had learned the cost of loose structure. They did not talk in slogans. They talked in terms. Maya proposed a $90,000 zero-interest machinery bridge for a beginning operator, secured by title only, 48-month schedule, seasonal payment windows after harvest. Ty argued for a stricter repair reserve clause. Nolan pushed for a weather contingency month without penalties. Lena caught an error in depreciation assumptions and corrected it before anyone signed. Cole listened, asked 2 questions about downside yield, and nodded when the math held. By noon, they had approved 2 new circle placements totaling $164,000, both funded from recipient repayments rather than Cole's direct capital. That was the hinge point the framework had been built to reach. One disciplined farm had become a funding engine that could keep moving even if Cole stepped back. The ledger line confirmed it. Principal recycled to date, $2,214,000. Cumulative interest charge, $0. Active contracts, 13. Cured delinquencies, 2. Permanent defaults, 0. On a windy day in April of 2027, the outcomes became visible in the fields. Maya planted her full 320 acres inside optimal window and finished with enough machine hours left to help a neighbor who had lost a transmission. Ty and Nolan rotated across their 420-acre combined footprint with lower input stress because their fixed obligations were clear and predictable. Lena closed on the remaining 65 acres in her staged block 3 years early after 2 strong seasons and 1 careful grain marketing run that lifted realized price by 31 cents per bushel over local average. She recorded the deed with Ramon beside her, and he stood in the hallway afterward with both hands in his jacket pockets, saying very little until he finally said, "Your grandfather would have known this ground again." Eli's trajectory stayed steady. He remained on salary, built retirement contributions to $126,400 by year-end 2028, and never missed a health insurance premium again. Dawn and Pete Voss renewed their fixed rent lease at terms they could carry, then purchased a used planter through a Circle referral for $27,800 cash instead of a finance package near triple that amount. Curtis Bell paid off his home loan in 2029, kept driving for the cooperative by choice, and took weekend dispatch shifts for extra savings instead of emergency debt service. Ramon expanded his mechanic bay, hired 1 apprentice, and posted $96,000 gross receipts in 2028 with no equipment note attached. Brent Halverson's resolution came in plain daylight at the county fairgrounds in August 2028 during a practical finance panel that had once been a sales event in all but name. He was still in a press shirt, still precise, but his slides had changed. One screen showed financed 7-year machinery costs. The next showed repair and cash alternatives with reserve targets. He clicked to a final comparison and paused. "I sold payment speed as if it was the same as resilience," he said. "It is not." He did not look at Cole immediately when he said it. Then he did. "I was wrong about him." After the panel, standing by the fence where 4 H-trailers lined up, Brent gave the rest of his outcome in quieter words. He was stepping down from full-time sales at the end of that year, shifting to advisory work on used equipment planning and training younger staff to run stress case math first, not last. "That bank call in 2023, he said. "I still hear that confirmation in my head when somebody asks what they can borrow." Cole answered with his usual economy. "Better question is what they can survive." Marlene Pike attended that same panel as a retiree and thanked both men for forcing better lending conversations in the county. Glenn Bartell's grandchildren leased out his remaining ground on conservative terms and kept his handwritten lease copy with Cole in a family file. Dean Lawson's grave marker was reset in 2027 after frost heave tilted the base, paid quietly by Cole with no note attached. Every thread sat in the open by then, nothing deferred, nothing hidden behind myth. By harvest 2029, the roll call had become measurable community structure. Maya owned her machinery free and clear and held title progression credits on all 320 acres she operated. Ty and Nolan had reduced their option principal enough to pull final deed transfer forward by 18 months. Lena owned the full 140-acre block and had funded her own first Circle note, covenant complete. Eli remained logistics manager and part-time mentor to new recipients. Dawn and Pete stayed current and stable. Curtis stayed debt-light and housed. Ramon's shop stayed booked 6 weeks out, mostly servicing older equipment that younger operators now preferred because payments did not own their seasons. Brent retired from commission sales, consulted 3 days a week, and never again mocked an old truck in a lot. Cole turned 59 in October 2026 and kept the same routines into the next years. The 1968 Chevrolet C10 passed 318,000 miles after a rebuilt carburetor and a replacement speedometer cable that finally stopped the needle jump that had annoyed him for 2 decades. The tailgate chain was replaced, but he left one piece of the old baling wire tied to a hook as a private reminder. The 1953 Farmall Super M still worked light-duty jobs, still started on cold mornings after proper choke, still got winter service on schedule. The notebooks were boxed, indexed by year, and copied to the county extension archive at Maya's insistence, so the arithmetic would outlive memory. The original feed sack, now too brittle for daily handling, went into a clear protective sleeve inside a tin document box with the first Farmall title and the paid receipt from Brent's parts counter dated March 1984, $187.43. County assessors marked his directly held land near 2,940 acres through that period, with additional acres in structured transfer. Depending on seasonal inventory marks, net asset value hovered around the same figure that had once sounded unreal in coffee shop talk. Yet his personal draw remained restrained, his house unchanged, his truck old, his coats mended. Appearance stayed modest by choice. Control stayed strong by arithmetic. The final image was never the auction check, or the speakerphone silence, or even the title stack. It was a kitchen table under a buzzing light, one generation after another leaning over numbers that had to work in dry years as well as wet ones. The man who looked poorest in Adams County had built the strongest balance sheet on his road, kept lines off his ground, and turned one private sentence on a feed sack into a public system that let other families keep theirs,